What if I told you a murder confessed on a national magazine, with every chilling detail, led to 0 jail time? 2 white men killed a black child and walked free, then sold their story for $4,000. And the woman who started it all? She lived in peace. If that doesn't make your blood boil, you haven't heard the whole story. Stay with me. It was a quiet funeral at first. The small church in Chicago held its breath as the pews filled with mourners, black families dressed in their Sunday best, reporters with notebooks clenched tight, and strangers who had never met the boy but came anyway. A coffin sat at the front, open, against every tradition, against every comfort. But that was exactly the point. Mamie Till stood nearby, her spine straight, her eyes dry from having cried too much. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and sharp, like the edge of a mother's broken heart. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy," she said. And the world did see that face, that mutilated, swollen, unrecognizable face. The face of Emmett Till, age 14, from Chicago, became America's mirror, a reflection of a truth it had long refused to face. But to understand how we got to this funeral, to this open casket, we have to go back just a few weeks, to a hot, heavy Mississippi afternoon, and a small grocery store with a squeaky screen door. August 1955. Emmett Lewis Till had never seen cotton fields before. Born and raised in the bustling city of Chicago, Emmett was used to streetcars, jazz on the corners, and kids who talked fast and walked faster. He had a smile that could light up a room, cocky, charming, full of life. His cousins called him Beau and joked that he talked too much. He did, and laughed even more. That summer, Mamie sent him to visit family in Money, Mississippi. It was supposed to be a change of pace, to get him out of the city for a while. She packed his bag carefully, reminded him to be polite, to watch how you talk to white folks, and kissed him goodbye. She didn't know it would be the last time. In Mississippi, Emmett was all curiosity and wonder. Everything was slower. The air was thick. The heat clung to your neck like a warning, but to a 14-year-old boy, none of it felt dangerous. It was just different. Until that day at Bryant's grocery and meat market, it was late afternoon. Emmett and his cousins biked down to the small store to grab candy and soda. The store sat at the edge of the black side of town, run by a white couple, Roy and Carolyn Bryant. Inside, it was dark and narrow, the kind of place that smelled like tobacco and dust. Emmett walked in with that Chicago stride, confident, easy. He grabbed some gum and, according to some accounts, may have said something to the young white woman behind the counter, Carolyn. Others said he whistled. Some claimed he called her baby. But here's the thing, no one really knows what happened. What we do know is that Emmett walked out of that store alive, smiling, maybe even trying to impress his cousins with big city bravado, just a kid being a kid. But Mississippi in 1955 wasn't the place to be young, black, and bold. What should have been a harmless moment, a smile, a joke, a boyhood dare, turned into a fuse lit beneath a keg of racial hatred. Carolyn Bryant, days later, would tell her husband that Emmett grabbed her, that he talked fresh, no witnesses, no proof, just her word. But in Jim Crow, Mississippi, that word was all it took. A few days later, 2 white men came knocking in the dead of night, and nothing would ever be the same again. They say doors can change everything. A door swings open to a grocery store, and history walks in. A boy buys some candy, and justice dies a little. A mother opens a casket, and the world finally looks. That's how it begins. This is the story of Emmett Till. A storm was brewing in the Delta, not the kind that shakes trees and floods roads, but the kind that moves silently, fed by whispers and glances, and explodes in the dark when no one's watching. In Money, Mississippi, there were rules, unwritten but clear as day. And in the minds of white men like Roy Bryant and JWMILAM, those rules had been broken. Carolyn Bryant was 21 years old, slender, soft-spoken, the kind of southern white woman whose word was rarely questioned, especially when it was aimed at a black boy. And that's exactly what made her dangerous. She waited 2 or 3 days to say something. When she did, she didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just said it, quiet, casual, like it was a simple fact. That boy from Chicago. He grabbed my hand, said he'd been with white women before, told me I didn't need to be scared. Roy Bryant's jaw clenched. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. In that world, a white woman's fear, real or imagined, was a loaded gun. And it had just gone off. Word traveled fast. By that weekend, Roy Bryant and his half-brother JWMILAM had returned from a trucking trip. They were big men, hardened by war and work, men who drank hard and didn't mind settling things the old way. To them, Emmett wasn't a child. He was a northern Nye who needed to be taught a lesson. In town, white folks nodded knowingly. Black folks went quiet. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew something was coming. Late on the night of August 28, 1955, the screen door at Moses Wright's house creaked open. It was just after 2 a.m. Moses, Emmett's great-uncle, answered the door in his long shirt, heart pounding. 2 white men stood on the porch, shadows behind them stretching into the house like claws. One had a pistol. The other carried a flashlight. "We're looking for the boy from Chicago," one of them said. Moses hesitated. "He's asleep." "What's this about?" "You know what it's about." They pushed past him. Emmett stood in the next room, sleepy-eyed, barefoot, wearing just a pair of pajamas. His cousin Simeon would later recall how Emmett didn't cry. He didn't beg. He got dressed, slowly, like he knew there was no way out. Mamie Till, years later, would remember this moment, though she wasn't there, playing it over in her mind again and again. She'd imagine his fear, his confusion, the sweat on his back as he buttoned up his shirt in silence. What was he thinking? Did he believe he'd be home by morning? Emmett followed the men outside into the pitch-black Mississippi night. He never came back. Back at the Bryant house, Carolyn waited inside while her husband and Milam brought the boy in. Some versions of the story say she was there, watching. Others claim she stayed in the bedroom. No one really knows. But by then, it didn't matter. Roy and Jurin T, looking for truth. They were looking to punish an idea. The idea that a black boy could smile at a white woman and not be afraid. They drove Emmett to a remote barn near Drew, Mississippi. What happened in the hours that followed is hard to put into words, not just because of its brutality, but because it wasn't just about Emmett anymore. It was about power, about control, about sending a message. They beat him. They crushed his face. They gouged out one of his eyes. They broke him. And when they were done, they tied a 75-pound cotton gin fan to his neck with barbed wire and dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River like he was trash. He was 14. Days later, a young boy fishing near the riverbank saw something floating in the water, bloated, twisted, bloated again. When the sheriff's men pulled the body out, it was nearly unrecognizable. The only thing left was a silver ring on one swollen finger, engraved with the initials LT. For Emmett's father, Louis Till, that's how they knew it was him. The local authorities wanted the body buried quickly, out of sight, out of mind. But Mamie Till had other plans. She demanded that her son be sent back to Chicago. When the coffin arrived, nailed shut, she told the undertaker, "Open it." He refused, she insisted. And when she saw what they had done to her boy, her knees buckled, but she stood back up. "We'll have an open-casket funeral," she said. "Let the people see what I've seen." It was no longer just about Emmett. It was about every black mother who had sent her son out into the world and prayed he'd come home safe. It was about every whispered threat, every burning cross, every lie turned into a lynching. Mamie's decision cracked something open in the American conscience. Jet magazine ran the photos of Emmett's body, unedited, raw, horrifying. The image of his face, swollen beyond recognition, his mouth gaped open, his eye hanging loose. It was too much to bear, but it had to be seen. The phone at the magazine office rang non-stop. Letters poured in. People wept in silence. People shouted. People got angry. This is what it meant to be black in America. For some, it was the first time they truly understood. For others, it was a pain they knew too well. And for Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, it was just the beginning of a trial they thought they couldn't lose. Because in 1955, Mississippi, white men didn't get punished for killing black boys. They got away with it, until now maybe, just maybe. And that faint glimmer of maybe was enough to make the nation hold its breath. They came for him in the dead of night. It was quiet in the Mississippi Delta, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and makes every creak in the floorboard feel like a shout. The moon hung low, swollen and pale, casting shadows across the cotton fields. Inside Moses Wright's little wooden house, everyone was asleep, until the knocking started. Bang, bang, bang. 3 sharp knocks, then silence. Moses Wright sat up slowly. He was 64, a preacher by calling and a father by heart. His hands trembled as he reached for the kerosene lamp. Behind him, children stirred, blankets rustled. He looked over at Emmett, sleeping on a cot, mouth slightly open, one leg hanging off the side like he didn't have a care in the world. He'd only been in Mississippi a few days, still full of that Chicago energy, big words, wide smiles, a city boy with no sense of southern danger. He was used to streetcars and corner stores, not lynch mobs and cotton fields. Moses tightened his robe and walked to the door. When he opened it, 2 white men stood there, one short and wiry, the other tall and broad-shouldered. One of them held a flashlight, the other held a pistol. "We looking for the boy from Chicago," the tall one said. "What's this about?" Moses asked, his voice low and cautious. The one talked fresh to a white woman. "We want to talk to him." Inside the house, Emmett was now awake. He heard the voices, felt the tension. He stood up, heart racing, eyes wide. His cousins clung to each other, frozen. "I'll bring him out," Moses said, trying to buy time. "He's just a boy. Don't matter." Moses brought Emmett to the doorway. The flashlight beam landed on his face. "That's him." "No, sir." Moses tried again. "He's not the one, boy." The tall man cut him off. "You got your shoes? Put 'em on." Emmett didn't speak. He looked at Moses. He looked at his cousins. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He simply nodded and went back to the cot, slipping on his shoes with the slow, shaky movements of someone who understood, even at 14, what this meant. It wasn't just a talk. He was going with them. And he wasn't coming back. Outside, the truck's engine rumbled low. Emmett climbed into the back, between the men who had come for him. One of them slapped the side of the truck, and it jerked forward, disappearing into the Mississippi night. Back inside the house, silence returned, but it was different now. It was heavier. The children cried. One cousin whispered, "They're gonna kill him." Moses Wright stood in the doorway for a long time, staring into the darkness, jaw clenched, fists balled. He had seen many things in his life. Poverty, fear, death. But this was the first time he felt utterly powerless. What happened over the next few hours is pieced together from confessions, rumors, and testimony. They drove Emmett around, through the flat fields of LaFleur County, down dirt roads lit only by moonlight. At one point they stopped and picked up more men. At another, they questioned him. "Why'd you do it? You think you can get away with talking to a white woman?" He didn't answer. Some say they pistol whipped him then. Others say they made him strip, forced him to carry the heavy fan they'd later tie around his neck. One version claims he begged for his life. Another says he stood silent, defiant. The truth is, we don't know, because only the killers were left to tell the story. And they never agreed on the details, just the outcome. They took him to a barn, remote, quiet, hidden behind rows of trees. And there, they beat him. They beat him until his face was no longer his, until his teeth shattered, until his eye dangled, until he couldn't scream anymore, until the only sound was the dull thud of bone against flesh. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they dragged his broken body to the Tallahatchie River. There, they tied a piece of barbed wire around his neck, securing a 75-pound cotton gin fan to his body. The weight of it meant to pull him down, hide the evidence, silence the outrage. They tossed him in like he was nothing. The water closed over him with a finality that felt biblical. Days passed. His family reported him missing. At first, no one seemed too concerned. The sheriff's office shrugged. "Probably ran off," someone said. Boys do that, but they knew better. On August 31, a boy fishing near the river saw something floating. The smell hit before the sight. Deputies pulled the body from the water, bloated, unrecognizable, grotesque. But on one finger, Barely clinging to the swollen skin was a ring, silver, inscribed with 2 letters, L.T. Louis Till, Emmett's father. That ring told the story. It was Emmett. The authorities wanted him buried quickly, quietly. A closed casket in Mississippi soil. But Mamie Till wasn't having it. She demanded his body be returned to Chicago. When the coffin arrived, the undertaker took one look and said, "We shouldn't open it." Mamie said, "We will." When the lid lifted, she gasped. The room spun. Her knees buckled, but she did not look away. And then, she did something no mother should ever have to do. She let the world see. She let the photographers come in. Let the reporters write it down. Let the mourners file past for hours, tears staining their cheeks, hands clutched to chests. Because she knew, the real crime wasn't just what they did to her boy. It was the silence that would follow, unless she broke it. And in that moment, in her grief, in her raw courage, Mamie Till cracked open the conscience of a nation. The boy didn't come home, but his story did, and it would echo through every courtroom, every protest, every whispered prayer for justice that followed. Because America could never again say it didn't know. The Tallahatchie River didn't run fast. It moved like molasses, thick, slow, quiet. The kind of river that held secrets deep in its muddy veins. The kind that whispered to the trees along its banks, but never told a soul. And for 3 long days, it kept one of the darkest secrets America had ever known. It was Wednesday, August 31, 1955, when a young black boy named Robert Hodges went down to the river to fish. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just trying to catch dinner for his family before the sun dipped too low. He was casting his line from the bank when he saw something bobbing in the current, half submerged, swaying gently like driftwood. But it wasn't driftwood, it was a body, swollen beyond recognition, bloated, twisted, waterlogged, one eye missing, skin barely holding together, a shape that looked more like a nightmare than a person. The boy ran. Authorities were called. Deputies arrived. They dragged the body to the shore, flinching at the stench, trying to make sense of the unrecognizable form before them. The corpse had been beaten beyond human form, the skull crushed, teeth missing, limbs bloated and purple. Around the neck, a length of barbed wire, and at the end of that wire, a 75-pound cotton gin fan, rusted and heavy with river muck. They tried to say it wasn't him. Could be anyone, someone muttered, until they found the ring. On the ring finger of the left hand, a silver signet, barely hanging on. Engraved were 2 initials, L.T. Louis Till, Emmett's father. It was him. The authorities wanted it over, quickly, quietly. Bury the body, move on. That was the pattern in Mississippi, but Mamie Till didn't do patterns. When she received the call, she didn't collapse. She didn't scream. She stood silent, heart clenched, her world already tipped off its axis. She made only one demand: send my son home. They tried to tell her the body was in no condition to be transported. They told her the smell was too much, the decay too far gone, that he was too gone. But she didn't care. A few days later, the box arrived in Chicago, sealed tight, screwed shut. The undertaker took one look and shook his head. "You don't want to see this." "Yes," Mamie said, calm and steady. "I do." He pried open the lid. Even he gasped. Emmett's body looked more like something out of a horror film than a human being. His head was swollen to nearly 3 times its size. One eye had been gouged out. His tongue hung grotesquely from his mouth. His nose was crushed. His skin, discolored from decomposition, peeled in places where the river had tried to reclaim him. Mamie stared. She didn't cry. She didn't faint. She studied him, inch by inch. "That's my boy," she whispered. She looked past what they'd done, past the brutality, past the disfigurement, and saw her son. She saw the baby she had nursed, the toddler who once tried to pour milk into his cereal and spilled it everywhere. The boy who whistled too much and laughed too loud. And then she made her decision. "Leave the casket open," she told the funeral director. He looked at her like she was mad. "No one can see this." "They have to," she said. "Let the world see what they did to my baby." Over the next few days, more than 50,000 people came through the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ to view Emmett's body. The line stretched down the block, around corners, and into the streets. Some people fainted. Others wept uncontrollably. Some just stared in silence, as if trying to reconcile what they saw with what they believed about their country. Jet magazine took photos. They published them in the next issue. Full page, raw, unfiltered. Emmett's face, Emmett's body, the ring, the fan. And America finally looked. The photos lit a fire. Suddenly, people in New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, people who thought lynching was something from a bygone era, saw the truth. It was still here, alive and well, wearing a smile in the South, and hiding behind just the way things are. In black households across the nation, parents pulled their children close. In barbershops and churches, people spoke Emmett's name like a prayer. In Harlem and Watts, in Atlanta and D.C., something shifted, something deep and ancient. Grief turned to rage. Fear turned to action. A new generation of Black Americans, many just a few years older than Emmett, began to feel it stir inside them. A refusal to sit quietly. A refusal to be next. This was no longer just a tragedy. This was a turning point. Mamie Till, overnight, became more than a grieving mother. She became a symbol, a voice, a vessel for a truth that white America had tried for too long to bury. Like that body, beneath muddy waters, chained to silence. She gave interviews. She told Emmett's story again and again, not with tears, but with fury, with purpose. 2 months ago, she said, I had a nice apartment in Chicago. I had a good job. I had a son. When something happened to the Negroes in the South, I said, that's their business, not mine. Now I know how wrong I was. The death of my son has shown me that whatever happens to any of us had better be the business of all of us. Her voice was steady, unshakable, and behind that voice stood the fan in the river, rusted, brutal, undeniable. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of how far white supremacy would go to protect itself, and of how far a mother's love would go to expose it. That fan never made it to evidence. The barbed wire was never fingerprinted. But the image of that battered body, that open casket, and that silver ring became burned into America's collective memory. Not as a relic, but as a reckoning. Sumner, Mississippi, population 600, give or take. In September 1955, it was a town dressed in its Sunday best, not for worship, but for spectacle. The Tallahatchie County Courthouse sat like a proud old lion in the center of town. Columns tall, flag waving, paint peeling under the southern sun. But for 5 days, it became something else, a stage. And everyone in it had a part to play. Outside, people gathered by the hundreds. White folks brought lawn chairs and sweet tea like they were at a picnic. Black folks stood to the side, tense and quiet. Every glance watched, every whisper measured. Reporters came from all over the country, New York, Chicago, even Europe. They filled the courthouse, notebooks ready, cameras clicking. It wasn't just a trial, it was a moment. Inside, the air was thick, with heat, with tension, with history. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam sat at the defense table, freshly shaved, wearing ties. They looked relaxed, smug even, like they already knew how the play would end. Their wives sat behind them. Carolyn Bryant, carefully shielded from the cameras, never took the stand. The jury, all white, all male. Not one black face in the box. Not one woman. Not one person who could look at Mamie Till and say, I know your pain. It was never really a trial. It was a performance. The prosecution presented what they could. Testimony from Emmett's uncle, Moses Wright, who stood, unbelievably, unshakably, and pointed a trembling finger across the courtroom. There he is, Moses said, voice barely above a whisper. The man who took Emmett. You could feel the silence sweep through the room like a cold wind. No black man in Mississippi had ever done that before, pointed at a white man and called him out in open court. It was brave. It was holy. It was almost unthinkable, but it wasn't enough. The defense called character witnesses. They painted Milam and Bryant as good men, family men, veterans. They tried to cast doubt on the body itself. That wasn't Emmett Till, the defense attorney said. That body was too far gone to tell. It could have been anyone. The ring could have been planted. It was ridiculous, insulting. But in that courtroom in 1955 Mississippi, it didn't have to make sense. It just had to sound like maybe. Maybe it wasn't Emmett. Maybe the boy had run off. Maybe this was all just northern agitation, trying to stir up trouble. They even suggested that the NAACP had faked the entire thing, a scheme to embarrass the South, a conspiracy, a hoax. Truth was drowning in that courtroom, just like Emmett had drowned in the river. And Mamie, she sat there every day, spine straight, face still, eyes locked on the men who had destroyed her son. She had buried her baby. She had opened the casket. And now she had come to bear witness. But the courtroom didn't want her grief. It wanted theater. And it got it. When the jury went out to deliberate, folks knew what was coming. Still, they waited. Some sat on car hoods. Some stood in the shade, fanning themselves. It took the jury 67 minutes to reach a verdict. One juror later joked, "It would have been quicker, but we stopped to drink a Coke." The verdict, not guilty. Roy Bryant and JWMILAM smiled. Mamie Till didn't cry. She sat still, a statue carved from pain and fire. Outside, cheers erupted. Reporters scribbled headlines. And somewhere in the crowd, someone said what many were thinking, a white man's life means more than a black boy's death. What happened next was even more galling. Just a few months after the trial, protected by double jeopardy, the legal rule that says you can't be tried twice for the same crime, Roy Bryant and JWMILAM admitted to the murder. They sold their story to Look magazine for $4,000. And they told it all. How they had beaten Emmett, how they had made him carry the fan, how they had shot him, how they had dumped him like garbage. They laughed about it, said the boy was sassy, said he had to learn a lesson. They showed no remorse, no fear, no shame, and still, no jail time, no punishment, nothing. They lived the rest of their lives, free men. But the story didn't die, because it was never just about Emmett. It was about a system where a white woman's lie outweighed a black boy's life, where a courtroom was just a room with chairs and flags and no justice in sight, where lynching didn't need a tree anymore, just a story, a courtroom, and the right kind of jury. But even in that twisted theater, something had shifted, because Jet magazine published the photo, because Mamie refused to stay silent, because people across the country, especially black people, had had enough. In the pews of black churches, Emmett's name became a prayer. In barbershops and lunch counters, it became a rallying cry. In the soul of a tired woman named Rosa Parks, it became a reason to stay seated on a Montgomery bus. "I thought of Emmett Till," she would later say, "and I couldn't go back." So maybe the trial was a farce. Maybe justice didn't come from the judge's gavel, but something deeper was stirred. Something louder than applause, stronger than a verdict, more enduring than fear. The theater ended, but the movement had just begun. It was January 2007, and the South had changed, or at least that's what it liked to say. Jim Crow was gone, legally at least. The signs had come down. The fountains were shared now. Schools were integrated on paper, and the courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, had been freshly painted and restored as a historical site. But some ghosts don't care about new paint. Some wounds don't close just because time passes. That winter, in a quiet living room in Raleigh, North Carolina, a frail woman sat across from a historian. Her name was Carolyn Bryant Donham. She was 72 years old. Her once sharp beauty now faded into the folds of time. She spoke softly, with the kind of measured caution that comes from a lifetime of silence. And then, almost offhandedly, she said it. He didn't do anything that deserved what happened to him. The room went still. She looked down at her hands, wrinkled, still wearing her wedding band from a husband who'd long since died. The part about him grabbing me, or making lewd remarks, that part's not true, she added. Just like that, with one sentence, half a century of lies collapsed. The story that started it all, the whistle, the flirtation, the threatening behavior of a black boy from Chicago, it was false. It had always been false. Carolyn Bryant, the woman at the center of the storm, admitted that Emmett Till had never touched her, never threatened her, never said a word that would warrant death. And still, she said nothing for 52 years. The confession came as part of interviews for a biography written by Timothy Tyson, a respected historian who had grown up in the South, deeply aware of its buried truths. He'd come to Carolyn not to accuse, but to ask, to understand. She agreed. Perhaps she thought it was time. Perhaps guilt had finally clawed its way to the surface. Or maybe, after decades of silence, she just wanted someone to know, but she wasn't shouting it from the rooftops. There were no press conferences, no apologies, no letters to Mamie Till's family, no admission in court, just a quiet sentence, whispered in a room, decades too late. When Tyson published her confession, it sent shockwaves through the country. Newspapers ran the headline, "Woman at Center of Till Case Admits She Lied, Black America Didn't Blink." Not because it wasn't shocking, but because it wasn't surprising. The lie had always felt hollow. The way it unraveled in court, the lack of evidence, the smugness of the killers, the gaping hole between the supposed crime and the unimaginable punishment. It had never added up. But now, the truth was confirmed. And yet, nothing happened. No charges were filed. The Department of Justice opened an investigation, yes. The FBI interviewed witnesses, reviewed files, revisited the river and the barn. But Carolyn was old now. Sick, they said, hard of hearing, fuzzy on details. There was no law in Mississippi that could charge her for what she had done, or rather, what she had failed to do. So she walked free. Again. To many, it felt like a second lynching. Not of Emmett's body, that had happened long ago, but of justice, of truth, of closure. The question haunted people. If she had spoken up in 1955, even whispered the truth to one person, would Emmett have lived? Could his life have been spared? Would Mamie have been spared the unbearable weight of burying her only child? Would the world have seen the inside of that coffin? Maybe the movement would have come later. Maybe it would have looked different, but maybe, just maybe, a boy would have grown up. He would have turned 15, then 16, maybe gotten a job, maybe fallen in love, maybe gone to college, maybe written poetry or fixed cars or become a teacher, maybe had kids of his own, maybe. But Carolyn Bryant's silence had stolen all of that, and her confession, though powerful, couldn't give it back. Still, the admission mattered. It mattered because it confirmed what so many had always known. It mattered because it forced America to stare at the uncomfortable truth. A lie can kill. A whisper can lynch. And silence can be deadly. It mattered because even though Carolyn wouldn't be held accountable in a courtroom, the court of public conscience had just received its final piece of evidence. And the verdict was clear. Mamie Till never lived to hear the confession. She passed away in 2003 at the age of 81, but in her final years she had already guessed the truth. In one of her last interviews, she said, "I do believe that woman lied. I don't need a confession. I know what my son was and what he wasn't." And she was right. Carolyn Bryant Donham died in 2023. No charges, no public reckoning, no words of remorse, just silence. But Emmett Till's name, his face, his story, lives on. In classrooms, in documentaries, in murals across America, in the sound of protest chants, in the voice of every mother who says, "Come home safe," and in the heartbeat of a movement that refuses to forget. Because a confession, even one whispered 50 years too late, is still a spark. And sparks, when caught by the right wind, can burn down systems. Let the wind blow. It began with a boy, not a man, not a rebel, not a martyr, just a boy, 14 years old. Loved comic books, laughed too loud, had a slight stutter, loved his mama fiercely. His name was Emmett, and they killed him for smiling. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Emmett Till wouldn't stay buried. Not really, because some stories refused to stay silent. On December 1, 1955, just 3 months after Emmett's mutilated body shocked the world, a black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, climbed onto a city bus after a long day of work. Her name was Rosa Parks. When the bus driver told her to give up her seat for a white passenger, she calmly refused. She didn't shout. She didn't fight. She just stayed seated. The world would later ask her why, and her answer was simple. "I thought of Emmett Till." and I couldn't go back. That moment sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, one of the first major sparks in the civil rights movement. A young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen to lead it. His voice would soon echo across the nation, but even he, years later, would say that Emmett Till was the one who woke him up, because Emmett wasn't just a victim, he was a beginning. As the 1960s erupted in marches and fire hoses and sit-ins and songs, Emmett's name followed the movement like a ghost and a guide. His open casket became the metaphor for all black pain left on display, for the world to see and still do nothing. But something had changed. Black people were no longer willing to sit quietly in pews and wait for justice to arrive on someone else's time. They were marching, shouting, demanding, and always remembering Emmett. In 1963, when Martin Luther King stood before hundreds of thousands on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he said, "I have a dream." But buried inside that dream was a scream, the one Mamie Till had swallowed, the one Emmett never got to let out. A scream that echoed across a generation. In 2009, the United States Congress finally passed legislation to establish the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, aimed at reopening cold cases of racially motivated murders. In 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, finally making lynching a federal hate crime. It had taken more than a century, but Emmett's name, his memory, was written into law, proof that a boy's death had become a fire that burned through generations of injustice. In the years since, his image has appeared everywhere, on murals in Chicago, his hometown, on walls in Mississippi, where he died, in classrooms across the country, in the faces of every black child warned to keep your hands visible, to speak politely, to never run. Because even now, decades later, the shadow of that barn, that fan, that river, still lingers. But so does the light of his story, a painful, beautiful, burning light. In 2023, on what would have been his 82nd birthday, a new national monument was established in Emmett's honor, spanning sites in Mississippi and Illinois. A memorial not just to his death, but to the change his death demanded. Mamie Till's voice echoes through those walls, still speaking, still teaching, still breaking the silence. "I didn't just lose a son," she once said. "The world lost a soul it didn't take time to know. But now we know. We say his name. We tell his story. We learn. We vote. We fight. Because Emmett's death didn't end with a coffin. It began with one. The men who killed him, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, died as free men. Carolyn Bryant died never facing justice. But justice sometimes is not about the courtroom. It's about what lives on. About how a mother's grief became a movement. About how a boy's face became a nation's reckoning. About how America was forced to look in the mirror and see itself. Not in denial, but in truth. And the truth is this: they tried to drown Emmett Till's body in the river, but what they really unleashed was a tidal wave. A wave of mothers who refused to let their children go unnoticed. A wave of sons and daughters who stood up when the system told them to sit down. A wave of history that kept coming, louder, stronger, deeper. Because Emmett's story didn't end in 1955. It began there, and it still burns. So when someone asks why we still talk about Emmett Till, why we still show the pictures, still march, still cry, tell them this: because we remember, because we refuse to forget, because the fire that took that boy lit the path for millions more, and because somewhere in this country, another boy is smiling too wide, laughing too loud, walking too free. And we won't let it happen again, not without a fight, not without fire, not without saying his name, Emmett. Louis T. Teen. If this story shook you, if it made you feel even 1 ounce of the pain, the injustice, or the rage that Mamie Till had to carry alone, then drop a #1 in the comments right now. Let it be a signal, a reminder that you see it, that you care, that you won't let history stay buried. Because here's the truth: a system that lets killers confess and still walk free isn't broken, it's built that way. And until we name it, until we teach it, until we remember it, it'll keep happening. The lesson? Silence is complicity, and awareness is the first step toward justice. So don't just watch, comment, share, speak. Be louder than the lies.